and it's so good to be with you all at Wahasu. You're an amazing community of practitioners, and I have something to get off my chest. George and I should have never had to write a book called Why Workplace Wellbeing Matters. The human case for investing in workplace well-being should be self-evident. We are human beings. We ought to care for each other, and the world of work, in which all of us spend so much time, ought to be a positive place as a result. So why then spend over 10 years researching the business case for investing in workplace well-being? Well, it's because the world of work isn't necessarily a happy place, and there's a huge gap between what senior leaders say and what they do in terms of workplace well-being. Does that resonate? Striking fact, an HBR survey on which we advised found that 87% of senior leaders that got to respond to the survey said, yes, I believe in workplace well-being, I'm a people manager, and this could be a competitive advantage for my company. In that same survey, when push comes to shove, and we're playing with prioritization, only a third actually prioritized employee well-being. Hold. Only half of those, 19%, had actually actions against that strategic priority. So there's a lot of work cut out for a lot of you working in this space, and a lot of research to be done to convince senior business leaders that this is not just the right thing to do, the human case, but also the clever thing to do, in other words, the business case. So where do we start? We start by measuring. And how do we measure workplace well-being? Well, there's only one way, and that's by asking people how they feel about their work and how they think about their work. And the 4 items we ask people are essentially, are you happy at work? Positive emotions. Are you not overly stressed at work? The experience of negative emotions. How do you think about your work? In other words, are you content? Job satisfaction. And then a more eudaimonic, a sense of purpose and worthwhile in the work you're doing. Importantly, these are 4 outcome indicators. They tell us how we feel. They don't necessarily tell us why we feel the way we do, and we'll get into those drivers to help explain and in which you can intervene. What is really exciting for us is that this approach, and a lot of you are experts in this room, you may have recognized where these items come from. These are essentially a mirror image of the consensus in positive psychology and subjective well-being when you try and capture general well-being of individuals, the affective, the evaluative, and the eudaimonic. What we've done is simply transpose this into the workplace. What's amazing is that players like S&P Global have now adopted these measures and sent it out to tens of thousands of major corporates. We've got amazing corporates, members of the World Wellbeing Movement, and others who've adopted these measures internally. But really what's going to drive a lot of change, I think, is the fact that it's actually being measured at a scale never seen before. And that's not me knocking on hundreds of thousands of organizations and their doors. That's because of an amazing organization called Indeed that you will be familiar with, the world's largest job search site. And they've adopted these items and have been crowdsourcing them at a scale never seen before. Over 20 million workers across many markets, mostly the US, UK, and Canada, but many other markets around the globe, they are now being surveyed and asked about their current or past employer. How do you feel at your work and why? Over 200 million data points as a result for us nerds to be able to play with. And what are we finding? Well, I wasn't lying to you. Only about 22% of global respondents actually put themselves as a 4 or 5 out of 5 on these outcome indicators for feelings at work. What are we finding in terms of organizations? Huge variation between organizations. There's organizations out there where the average response amongst their population of workers is 2 out of 5, and there's organizations out there where the average is closer to 4 out of 5. And we are able to compare literally hundreds of thousands of organizations in like-for-like comparisons, which is really and truly unique. And what we're finding is that these differences aren't just between the tech and, say, the hamburger industry. It's within these industries you'll find huge variation. And even within companies, because that's how rich these crowdsourced data are, even in companies that aren't particularly well known for being great workplaces, you will find units that are doing well. Or in areas, regions around the United States or the United Kingdom that are difficult regions where the economy isn't doing all that great, you will still find in tough industries, in tough companies, in those tough regions, still find examples. So let nobody ever tell you that it is not possible to improve workplace well-being, because you will find examples of plants or manufacturing or warehouses in tough industries that are doing well. All right, what explains the differences between these organizations and how people at these companies feel? Well, for that, you need to dig into the drivers of workplace well-being. And so on the Indeed survey, we also ask about all kinds of aspects that can help explain why people feel the way they do. And this can involve basic questions like, are you being compensated fairly? Do you trust your coworkers? Do you have flexibility, appreciation, belonging, inclusion, learning, achievement, and so on and so forth? This is not an exhaustive list. There's other things, health and safety, voice, autonomy, that you can all and should be measuring in your workplaces to try and help think about why people feel the way they do. And these are also the kind of drivers that you can possibly and positively intervene upon to try and then ultimately improve the indicators for workplace well-being. And if you're keen to find out more about how to best intervene on the drivers of workplace well-being, look no further than the World Wellbeing Movement's playbook on interventions for well-being. All right, what are we finding that actually matters for workplace well-being? Well, if you ask people, and this would be a good moment to pause and reflect yourself for a second, what is most important for you or your team in driving workplace well-being? Well, if you ask people, then typically what comes to the fore is fair compensation, flexibility. However, what we're actually finding is, if it's helping us, is a sense of belonging, feeling energized, inclusion, managerial support, etc. That doesn't mean that pay and flexibility aren't important. All of these things are important, but there's a relative importance. Some things are more important than others. And as it turns out, it's really the social elements, our social capital around the workplace, that matters a great deal, because you recognize belonging, inclusion, managerial support are all social elements. What do we mean with belonging? Goes back to the human case. We want to be treated well and feel like we're being cared about by the organization, our line manager, and have meaningful social ties at work. That's it. That's the main thing that will keep us excited to go to work. All right. The business case, as you've never seen it before. So does any of this matter when you're speaking to the CEO and the CFO? Well, let me share with you 3 pieces of evidence on each one of the pathways to impact, as we call it. The first one is productivity, the second one is attraction, and the third one is retention of your talent. And we'll see how each one of these, we've produced extraordinary evidence that took us quite a bit of time to try and convince the more skeptics out there amongst the CEOs and the CFOs. So first, productivity. How did we do it? We worked with British Telecom, known as BT in the United Kingdom, huge employer, and all of their call center employees. And we pulsed them on Thursday afternoons every week to get a sense for how people were feeling. Really just emotional well-being, basic, like a calendar invite. They came in, they clicked on one of the smiles, and off it went into our database. The reason why call center employees are really interesting to economists is that there's an extraordinary amount of granular level performance data available at the individual level. So there's no other sort of job type that you can really link how people feel to how productive they are. From seconds per call, customer satisfaction per call, to weekly sales, which was obviously the thing that the CFO was most interested in. What you're seeing on this slide here is the causal effect of how we feel as individuals from one week to another. This is not between individuals. This is your well-being from one week to another and how it fluctuates. Well, if you move up a point on this scale, you'll find that there's significant increases in weekly sales. So a whole change would mean a 12% increase in weekly sales. Notice that if you dig a bit deeper in this research that we've now published, is that this is a lower bound estimate of the effect of how you feel on how good you perform for the business. Why? When we zoomed in tasks that require social and emotional intelligence, like dealing with a disgruntled customer who calls in and retaining their business or selling a more complex package, those kind of things, or if you're in other industries, client-facing or brainstorming type sessions that require creativity, those kind of tasks, the gradient of this curve was way steeper. We're talking 25, 30% impact of how you felt on how you performed for the more complex tasks that require social and emotional intelligence. I don't have to tell you this, it's intuitive. You can't work well with others if you're not in a good place yourself. You can't connect with clients on the other side of the counter if you're not in a good place yourself. And we've been able to show this causally in a way that I would recommend you actually dig into. Second pathway to impact, talent attraction. Here we leverage our wonderful partnership with our friends at Indeed, and it's my co-author on the book, George Ward, who for his PhD at MIT Sloan leveraged the rollout of the work well-being score on the platform. And what he did, sit tight, he randomized 24 million job seekers into either seeing the crowdsourced data around how people feel at these companies they're thinking about applying to versus not seeing the control group, business as usual. Guess what happened? Job seekers' search behavior and applications are sensitive to this. So if it was a higher work well-being score, they were more likely to put their applications in and vice versa. What does this mean for the organization? And I'll put numbers on it. We now have so much data and so much time series that we've seen organizations move in terms of their work well-being score over time and how job seekers respond. You want the headline figure? For a single point increase in the work well-being score, and this time on a scale to 100, so 1 point on a scale to 100, 1 point improvement translates into a 1.3% increase in job applications. Let that sink in, but also the notion that those are the job applications you want. It's the more talented, more picky people that are likely the ones that are more likely to get the job. So investing in workplace well-being and all these big data news sources that make it available and make it public how people are feeling at your company, whether it's Glassdoor or Indeed or any other sort, it is moving their job search behavior, and you will attract a better talent to begin with because of it. All right, third pathway. Does it matter for retention? The most obvious one, and you're going to say, duh, of course. But I don't think you've seen the data as strong as you will see now. What you're seeing here is all of the US listed companies that we have data for, pretty much all of them on the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ. About 1,800 of the largest companies that some of you may be working for, including our friends at Hyatt, who are a sponsor of WAHASU. You're all part of this study. What you're seeing here is the top 5% of those companies sitting around 4 out of 5, as I mentioned earlier, and the bottom of the listed companies in terms of workplace well-being, they're more like a 2 out of 5 in terms of average workplace well-being coming back through the crowdsourced survey. And we've mapped that onto the vertical axis is actual voluntary annual turnover. And what you're seeing is something very basic, but very important in the HR space, which is that higher workplace well-being, you're losing a third less of your people at the end of the year. And anybody in the HR space knows just how costly it is to lose talent, having to find them again, getting them up on the learning curve, and getting them fully activated within your organization. So all these things have cost implications. All right, so all these pieces of research that George and I and others in our field have been doing are sort of coming together in what we call a dynamic model of workplace well-being. We're starting to get to grips with every one of these angles and arrows in this approach. The first thing is getting measurement right, distinguishing the measurement from the drivers, what helps explain it. We're starting to have a good sense of the relative importance of what is most influential in actually explaining how people feel at work. That's the drivers of work well-being. And then we look at the outputs, the downstream consequences of changes in workplace well-being. And they run through these pathways to performance, raising productivity, recruiting talent, and retaining your talent. Now, I talked about a business case for well-being. I haven't actually shown you a business case yet. Why is that? All of these are just the benefits of higher workplace well-being. I haven't talked about the costs side. I can talk to you about our BT study all day long, how improving workplace well-being leads to 12% increase in weekly sales. But that CFO that we all despise might come back saying, yes, fine, but it might cost me more to try and raise workplace well-being by as much amongst our call center employees. So how do we deal with that? Well, we need to look at the overall performance of an organization that takes into account both the benefits of being a good place to work, as well as whatever it takes in terms of cost to effectively raise workplace well-being. And that's what I'm going to show you now, and is really truly the business case. So first of all, again, kudos to our friends at Indeed. We looked at all these listed companies in the United States that we have data for, about 1,800, which is extraordinary. And what you're seeing here, again, is that, in this case, deciles from about 2 to about 4 is the range of workplace well-being across these companies. And these companies, every quarter, have to report systematically their firm value, their profitability, and actual gross profits in billions of dollars. What you're seeing here is a correlation between the average well-being and whatever these companies do to raise workplace well-being, and the investments they take and the time and the resources that go into raising workplace well-being, it pays off. On balance, there's more net gains. The benefits are higher than whatever it takes them to raise workplace well-being. And this, we're talking billions. So for example, a company with an average, a listed company with an average of a 2 or 2.5 out of 5 workplace well-being, gross profits is about 4.5 billion. And then the ones that are doing better at 3.5, 4 out of 5, we're talking about 6 billion average. And that's sort of across the board, across industries, across size, across everything. You'd say, oh, this is correlational, and I mentioned it already. What can we do? Well, we can't really run randomized controlled experiments with these big companies and manipulate their well-being one way or another. But what we can do is start looking over time. So what we've done here also, and you find this in the academic papers, is to see, is there a predictive power to these workplace well-being scores? Is it a leading indicator? And so, for example, what we've done in these lines of analyses is to show, okay, how about the 2020 workplace well-being data? Is it predictive of 2021 performance, 2022 performance, 2023 performance? And lo and behold, it stays very strongly correlated, though with every year, slight decline, as one would expect in terms of predictive power. But even 4 years hence, the well-being scores of 4 years ago are predictive of financial performance 4 years later. That's really darn powerful. But the one analysis that got most attention in the media is this one. And it's, I guess, our favorite because it also speaks to your own investing strategies, I guess, is the following. Now that we had, and it was sort of a little moment where we were all looking at the data with the team at Indeed, and Janine is here, which is amazing. She leads it at Indeed. And George and I were thinking, wait a second, now that we have all these listed companies that we can start comparing, how about if we believe in our own business case material, then we ought to invest in that, shouldn't we? And the idea came up to essentially produce a synthetic portfolio based off the Indeed crowdsourced data. What you're seeing here is the typical benchmarks, S&P 500, the Russell, the NASDAQ Composite. And you will remember 2021 was a bull year, then we had a bear market, 22, and then lots of volatility, and then very good all the way into January 2025. Now it's very volatile and not going so great, I'm sorry to say, and you will probably notice that in your portfolios. But we've updated it all the way till the end of the year and into January 2025, especially for Wahasu. And the results of a stock portfolio of simply taking the top 100 companies purely based on how their people are feeling at the company, whether it's a good place to work, according to the people themselves, not a pay-to-play, great place to work type approach. No, your people telling us behind the CHRO's back whether they think it's a good place to work. The honest truth, in other words. Well, look at this. And so every year, it outperforms the traditional stock market stock market indices. And right now, at the end of this last year, so on January 1st, had you invested solely on good places to work, according to the people's own voices, Our stock market portfolio is at $1,700, the S&P is at $1,600, and NASDAQ is at $1,500. That's big numbers for big players. And so it's wonderful to see this because it shows it's a leading indicator of performance, and something that stock markets either don't have much feeling with, no pun intended, or are underestimating massively. So there you have it, the business case that should have never been proven. And here's a book that should have never had to be written. I'll happily sign copies, but I've understood all the books are already gone. And so this QR code will get you copies, and it's coming out essentially next week, or a week and a half from now. And so it's been the privilege of a lifetime, and thanks to Karen to be able to present it to you ahead of time.